Let's get right into it. War. It's one of the oldest, most brutal realities of human existence. It's about power, survival, and sometimes justice, or at least, that's how it's framed. But here's the question that's bothered philosophers, generals, and citizens for centuries: can there be rules for something so inherently chaotic and destructive? Is it even possible to regulate something designed to shatter lives, cities, and entire nations? To understand how we arrived at the idea of rules of war, we need to face a hard truth. War isn't going away. Across human history, every culture, every civilization has engaged in it. And while the weapons and strategies have evolved, the underlying reasons haven't. Territory, resources, revenge, ideology, these are constants. But if war is inevitable, does that mean anything goes? Are there limits, or is war just the ultimate free-for-all? This is where just war theory steps in. It's not a modern invention. The idea that war should have rules stretches back thousands of years. Ancient Hindu texts, like the Mahabharata, discuss ethics in battle. Ancient China's Sun Tzu taught strategies rooted in efficiency and avoiding unnecessary harm. In the West, philosophers like Cicero, Augustine, and later Thomas Aquinas began to formalize these ideas into what we now call just war theory. Their goal wasn't to glorify war, it was to ask, if we're going to fight, how do we do it without losing our humanity? But let's pause for a second. What does it mean to be just in the middle of war? Does it mean choosing the lesser evil? Does it mean sticking to some moral framework, even if it puts you at a disadvantage? And who gets to decide what's just the victor? The historian? The people whose lives are destroyed in the process? These are the questions just war theory forces us to confront.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
At its core, just war theory is built on two major ideas: jus ad bellum, the justice of going to war, and jus in bello, justice during war. Let's break those down. Jus ad bellum is about when it's acceptable to start a war. It asks questions like, is this war necessary? Is it a last resort? Are the reasons behind it legitimate? If you're fighting to defend yourself or protect innocent lives, that might be justified. If you're fighting for greed, revenge, or conquest, it's not. But here's where things get tricky. What counts as legitimate? Take self-defense, for example. If your country is invaded, defending yourself seems straightforward. But what if the threat is less clear, like an attack that hasn't happened yet but seems inevitable? Is a preemptive strike justified, or is it just a way to rationalize aggression? This gray area is where the real debates happen, and it's where war's moral boundaries start to blur. Now let's move to jus in bello, the rules for how war is fought. Even if a war is justified, there are limits to what's acceptable on the battlefield. You can't just do anything to win. The principles here are about proportionality and discrimination. Proportionality means the harm you cause should never outweigh the good you're trying to achieve. Bombing a city to take out one enemy soldier? Not proportional. Discrimination means targeting only combatants, not civilians. Civilians aren't part of the fight, so killing or harming them is never justified. But here's the problem in modern warfare, where drones and bombs blur the lines between combatants and civilians. How do you draw that line? Think about this for a moment. If war is already about breaking rules, breaking treaties, invading borders, taking lives, why would anyone follow the rules of war? The answer lies in survival, reputation, and long-term strategy. If war descends into total chaos, everyone loses. Rules create a structure, even in destruction. They offer a way to hold on to some shred of humanity, even when everything else is falling apart. But let's not romanticize this. Even with rules, war is still devastating. Civilians still suffer. Soldiers still die. Cities still burn. The rules of war don't make war good, they just try to make it less bad. And that raises a haunting question: is it enough? Is regulating war like trying to control a wildfire with a garden hose? Or is it the only thing stopping us from plunging into complete barbarism? Let's get straight to it. War has changed. The battlefield is no longer clear. There aren't always soldiers in uniforms lining up on opposite sides, following agreed-upon rules. Instead, we have drones striking targets thousands of miles away, cyber attacks disabling entire nations, and insurgents blending into civilian populations. So here's the question: can the principles of just war theory rules written for a very different time still hold up in the chaos of modern warfare? Let's start with jus ad bellum, the justice of going to war. Remember the idea that war must be a last resort. That sounds great in theory, but in practice, how do you define last resort? In the 21st century, we've seen wars justified on the basis of preemptive strikes or spreading democracy. But are those legitimate reasons or convenient excuses? Think about the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan. Leaders claimed they were necessary for self-defense or to prevent terrorism. But critics argued those wars were more about politics, resources, or control. Who gets to decide which interpretation is right? This isn't just an abstract debate, it's life and death. When leaders make the decision to go to war, they're gambling with millions of lives. Just war theory demands that they weigh their reasons carefully. But here's the uncomfortable truth: war is often driven by fear, ambition, or misinformation. And once the fighting starts, it's almost impossible to reverse course. So how do we hold leaders accountable? How do we ensure that the reasons for war are truly just and not just politically convenient? Now let's look at jus in bello, the rules for how war is fought. Proportionality and discrimination are supposed to limit the harm caused by war. But modern warfare makes this incredibly complicated. Take drones, for example. On one hand, drones can target enemy combatants with precision, potentially reducing civilian casualties. On the other hand, drone strikes often kill bystanders and fuel resentment among local populations. So are drones making war more ethical or just more detached? And what about nuclear weapons? They're the ultimate challenge to just war theory. Proportionality? Gone. A single nuclear strike kills indiscriminately, wiping out entire cities. Yet nuclear deterrence is built on the idea that having these weapons, being willing to use them, prevents war altogether. Is that ethical? Or is it a dangerous game where the stakes are too high? The mere existence of nuclear weapons forces us to ask, can there ever be justice in a war where the potential for total annihilation exists? Let's also talk about insurgency and terrorism. These forms of warfare often ignore traditional rules entirely. Insurgents blend into civilian populations, making it nearly impossible to distinguish combatants from non-combatants. Terrorist groups intentionally target civilians to spread fear. And when governments respond, they often use heavy-handed tactics that blur the line between justice and revenge. In this kind of asymmetric warfare, can just war theory even function? Or is it an outdated framework for a world that no longer plays by the rules? This leads to a critical problem: accountability. Just war theory is supposed to hold combatants to a higher standard. But who enforces these rules? International law exists, with institutions like the International Criminal Court. But the reality is, powerful nations often ignore these laws when it suits them. War crimes go unpunished. Civilians suffer without justice. And the rules of war, rules meant to protect the innocent, are treated as optional guidelines rather than binding commitments. But there's more to this. War doesn't just challenge morality, it also exposes the limits of our morality. Imagine you're a soldier on the ground, faced with impossible decisions. Your enemy is hiding in a school or hospital. Do you strike, risking civilian lives, or hold back and let them escape? Or think about a leader deciding whether to negotiate with a terrorist group. Do you give them what they want to save lives, knowing it might embolden them to strike again? These aren't hypothetical scenarios. They're the brutal realities of war, where every choice has consequences. And yet, even in the chaos, the principles of just war theory still matter. They remind us that war is not a free-for-all, that there are lines we shouldn't cross even when it's inconvenient or costly. They challenge us to hold on to our humanity, even when everything around us is falling apart. But here's the thing, just war theory isn't perfect. It's a framework, not a solution. It gives us tools to think about war ethically, but it doesn't guarantee that war will ever be truly just. So here's the deeper question: is it even possible to fight a war that aligns with these principles? Or are the rules of war more about limiting damage than achieving justice? And if that's the case, how do we reconcile the idea of just war with the reality that war almost always leaves destruction, suffering, and loss in its wake? Let's face it, the idea of a truly just war feels like an impossible contradiction. How can something built on destruction ever be ethical? But that's exactly what we have to wrestle with if we want any hope of limiting the horrors of war in the future. The world isn't becoming more peaceful. Technology is advancing, geopolitics are getting more complex, and conflicts are becoming harder to classify. So where does just war theory go from here? Let's start with technology. Modern warfare is no longer just boots on the ground or tanks rolling across borders. It's drones striking targets in remote areas. It's cyber attacks that cripple economies without firing a single bullet. It's artificial intelligence making split-second decisions that can determine life or death. These developments are raising questions that just war theory wasn't originally designed to handle. Take autonomous weapons, for example, machines programmed to kill without direct human control. On one hand, they could make war more precise, reducing human error and collateral damage. But on the other hand, who is responsible when these machines get it wrong? If a drone controlled by AI bombs a hospital instead of a military target, is it the programmer's fault? The commanders? The government's? Or no one's? The lines of accountability blur, and that's a huge problem. Then there's the issue of cyber warfare. Imagine a hacker shutting down the power grid of an entire country. No bombs are dropped, no soldiers deployed, but the consequences are devastating. Hospitals fail, food supplies rot, people freeze in the dark. Is that an act of war? And if so, what's a proportional response? Can you justify launching missiles in retaliation for a cyber attack? Just war theory struggles to answer these questions because it was built in a time when war was primarily physical, not digital. But technology isn't the only challenge. The very definition of war is changing. Traditional wars between nation-states are becoming rarer. Instead, we're seeing more asymmetric conflicts, where small groups of insurgents or terrorists fight against larger, more powerful forces. In these situations, the principles of just war theory, proportionality, discrimination, last resort are harder to apply. When one side hides among civilians or uses guerrilla tactics, how do you fight back without violating the rules? And what about non-state actors? Terrorist groups, drug cartels, even powerful corporations. These entities wield enormous influence and can cause immense harm, but they don't fit neatly into the traditional framework of war. Can just war theory adapt to address conflicts where one side isn't a nation at all? Or does this require an entirely new way of thinking about justice in warfare? Now let's bring this down to a human level. One of the most enduring criticisms of just war theory is that it often focuses on leaders and generals, the people making the big decisions, while ignoring the individuals caught in the crossfire. Civilians, soldiers, refugees, what about their perspective? War doesn't just happen on a battlefield. It happens in homes, schools, hospitals, and marketplaces. Any future version of just war theory needs to take this into account, centering the experiences of those who suffer the most. But here's a twist: just war theory doesn't just limit itself to the battlefield. It's also about what happens after the fighting stops. This is called jus post bellum, or justice after war. How do you rebuild a society that's been torn apart? How do you treat prisoners, refugees, and defeated enemies? And perhaps most importantly, how do you ensure that the peace that follows isn't just a pause before the next conflict? These questions are just as important as the ones about when and how to fight. Let's look at this from a global perspective. If the rules of war are going to mean anything in the future, they need to be enforced universally. Right now, powerful nations often act with impunity, while smaller nations face consequences for the same actions. This double standard undermines the very idea of justice. If we're serious about creating a more ethical battlefield, then international law has to apply equally to everyone, no exceptions. And let's not forget prevention. The ultimate goal of just war theory isn't to justify war, it's to minimize it. The more we understand about the causes of conflict, poverty, inequality, political instability, the more we can work to address those causes before they explode into violence. Imagine a world where the focus isn't on how to fight wars, but on how to avoid them altogether. That might sound idealistic, but isn't that the point of having rules in the first place? So here we are. War is evolving, and the rules need to evolve with it. But the big question remains, can just war theory ever truly create an ethical battlefield? Or is it just a way to make us feel better about something that's fundamentally immoral? And if we accept that war will never be perfect or fair, does that mean we should stop trying to make it better? Let me leave you with this: if you had the power to rewrite the rules of war for the future, what would you prioritize? Would you focus on limiting suffering, holding leaders accountable, or preventing war altogether? And more importantly, would the rules you create actually be followed, or would they be broken, like so many before them? Because at the end of the day, rules don't mean anything unless people choose to honor them. And that's the hardest part.